Hey, Dr. Brett. I have been watching the news and probably like anyone on any side of the political spectrum, I'm generally pretty annoyed. A recent press conference, for example, where Pete Hegseth was condemning the state of Iran for treating its people terribly by investing only in bombs and military expenses and then not being able to provide healthcare or basic needs to its citizens. And then later on that day, Trump is in some private meeting that gets revealed where he's saying that in the US, we have no money for childcare because we have a war to fund. And not only is this just infuriating as a citizen of this country and as a citizen of the world, knowing how we are contributing to just the most disgusting acts currently imaginable on many fronts, not just in Iran. But it made me think about, we talked about accusation as confession a while back on the pod. And a lot of what's happening in politics for me just makes me ask this question: why are the people that are most loudly condemning others often describing themselves? I'm curious about why hypocrisy works as this public script that we're living through, and why naming it rarely seems to be enough, because it's pretty obvious that accusation is confession, but it also doesn't feel sufficient just to name it and say, I was right. This is the Doc to Doc podcast.
It's voice notes turned podcast. Place as perspective. Welcome back to the Doc to Doc podcast. Nice to be with you all again. My name is Dr. Brett, and I'm coming to you from a sunny, little crisp spring morning, Fullerton, California.
Hey folks, I'm Nicole. I'm based in Washington, D.C., where it is almost 90 degrees today, hot and humid.
My goodness.
So welcome to the swamp. We're officially here and it's mid-April.
And a DC humid is not a pleasant humid.
It's not great. However, I'm, for the listeners, I'm from the desert. Shout out to Arizona, which is a dry heat, very famously, and it's something we love to joke about. And Brett, everybody.
So true, though.
It's so true. I will take humidity over a dry heat any day. So even though I know you're looking, okay,
What?
For listeners, if you're just listening and you haven't seen the video, you might want to go back and look at Brett's face, because I just got the most flabbergasted response ever. It's a hot take.
That is quite literally a hot take.
Let me explain, and then we can definitely get into the pod. But so my rationale is this: when you are in a place like Arizona and it is 110, usually I think the threshold, and this is a really strange thing, but you'll know it because you've lived there.
Yeah.
I think anything under 108 degrees is manageable.
Yeah.
As soon as you go over 108 degrees Fahrenheit, you're like, ah, shit. Okay, now I'm way too in it. But the problem with dry heat is you're in an oven. You're in a convection. There's never any point when you are outside that you will have respite in terms of shade or anything. Like, you can't cool down unless you create some kind of moisture for yourself. So then the reason why I don't mind the humidity that much is, it's sticky as fuck and it's gross and I want to take 4 showers a day. However, if I find a little tree, if I sit under the shade, I can cool down.
I think I disagree here. And this is, we haven't had our weather episode yet, and we will have to bring on a weather doc. I actually experienced this differently. And I think this comes back to the comment that I made a couple episodes ago about, like, how is the temperature not what you feel it as? Like, how are those different things? And the way that I experienced this, having lived in mostly only humid places, Chicago, New York, Minneapolis, was living in the tropics in Costa Rica, humidity, I feel like, is inescapable. That moisture is everywhere and it is in the shade. Then the moisture is not any less unpleasant whether or not you're in the sun. You cannot escape the air. Whereas my experience of the oven, and the way that I would describe the dry heat for folks who'd never experienced it, was that it's like sticking your hand into the oven. Like you're cooking something. The sun in the desert is like sticking your hand in the oven. It is that quick sort of searing heat. But as soon as you take your hand out, which is stepping into the shade, it is not nearly as hot. You don't feel the heat in the same way if you're not in direct sunlight, where I feel like the dry heat, you can escape the worst of it by stepping into the shade. You cannot escape humidity.
We disagree.
Yeah.
All
Well,
we
and
can
this
say
is,
is it's hot today, Brett.
yeah. Hmm.
It's hot and humid, so
All right. So
but that's
for
not what
our
we're
listeners who have been on this season 2 weather journey with us,
talking
it was
about.
a slow burn, but we are actually getting somewhere substantive in our exploration of weather. So we definitely had planned this. No, we did not.
No.
But we are getting, like, this is, the advantage of a slow burn conversation, and we are getting interesting places. And I feel like you and I are going to learn more about weather science in the comments, in the text messages. Weather doc, maybe weather docs are going to come for us on this
I
one.
live with the weather doc. I'm grilled after this, so
Yeah. But on that note, I got your voice memo. And, this was a conversation that I think we were going to end up coming back to one way or another. I think the direction that your voice note referred to and how we're revisiting this conversation on accusation and confession is maybe from a different angle, but it was it was a comment that I made within our discussion in the first episode of this season in talking about can men and women be just friends. It was a hotter take. I think I may have said that at the time. It is one I continue to stand by, but it's one that ruffled some feathers in the sense that it got folks thinking and reflecting.
Mhm.
So I don't know how much we're going to build on that initial conversation, but that is one of the foundations, I think, for what initiated at least the way that you are thinking about some of the topics that you brought up in your voice memo.
Yeah, 1,000%. I hadn't heard it framed that way, or maybe I did and it just never stuck. But when you said every accusation is a confession at the start of the season in that episode, I couldn't not sit and sort of percolate on that. And I know, yeah, we wrestled on it in an earlier episode. If so, folks haven't listened, go back to first opening episode of the season of season 2. But I couldn't not think about it because as it related to relationships, I was a little skeptical. But then I was thinking about it in a political context. Every time I see something on the news, particularly with this administration, and I would say more conservative, far right, fascist, which there are a lot of them, unfortunately, in the world.
Mhm.
Anytime I see these news headlines or stories, and the one that I was alluding to in my voice note, I see this reflected in the way that there's a lot of politics going on right now. And it's really hard for me to not see what, and I'll say in the United States, for example, the Trump administration is doing as not a spot on like example of what you said, of like every
Mm.
accusation that this party is, saying against the left, the radical left, the woke party, terrorist Democrats. I mean, whatever kind of association that they're creating, which is always really extreme in nature, ends up being a confession of exactly what they're doing. And it's an interesting moment, I think, because right now there are a lot of fractures within the political party, within the Republican Party, the MAGA sort of stronghold, and even adjacent to the people that are in Washington, D.C., people in the pod sphere, a lot of these influencers that were previously super MAGA, super pro Trump,
Mm.
are beginning to fracture, whether it's the Epstein files or more recently with the conflict and the war unnecessarily in Iran. Like you're
Or the
seeing that.
photo that just got the AI photo of Trump making himself as Jesus, which now interestingly seems to be the final straw for a lot of folks. But it's like,
Yeah.
why now? It's
Yeah.
why now? Because he's said similar things before and he's posted, ridiculous mashup images of himself, and that now folks are starting to draw the line using some of these other indicators when it's probably something else like the economy, but they can't really say that. So they're using these other sort of veils.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, it's the sort of soup of all of these things together, and it's interesting that you're mentioning the religious aspect because I really do want to talk a little bit about that, and how that I think is a fundamental pillar to this as well. But generally, yeah,
Fundamental.
it was not a pun, but thank you. These accusations feel like deep-seated confessions because I see through the hypocrisy, I'm seeing what they're doing.
Hmm.
And then in this moment, more recently, because there have been a lot of flips, because it seems like people are finally in earnest, who were huge supporters, these acolytes of Trump and MAGA are also now changing their tune. They're pointing out the BS. On one hand, it's exactly like you're saying, where it's like, wow, this is interesting that they finally have reached this point where their cup is filling over and they've had enough and they've turned against him. But then on the other hand, I'm just like, how did you sit with this for so long? Why is this that breaking point? I wanted us to have a conversation about accusation and confession today in the context, sure, of politics and current events, because I do think that it's a strong demonstration that our listeners will be familiar with. I think it's important to call that hypocrisy out. But I also wanted to think about it as it reveals the stakes and the positions of speakers, because on one hand, I think it is fulfilling to kind of have that told you so moment, but it never feels sufficient. I think being right in this context of, oh, I knew when they said this that they actually meant this is fine, but it's not sustaining. And I feel like
Mhm.
there's a deeper conversation that you and I can have about how we might be able to do something productive with this acknowledgement and this recognition.
I think to your point that the told you so moments are not fulfilling, in part because, as you said, it is about the larger conditions that are producing them. And like last week, we talked about the metaphor of the tree as being our culture, and
Uh-huh.
that tree does not have a political affiliation. We are all growing up in that culture, and some of us, kind of often based on political leanings, are more aware of the tree, but it is not something that liberals, leftists, Democrats are exempt from. And just as at the top of the show, I think it's worthwhile because I think we are going to point our lens in a particular direction throughout a lot of this conversation. It is worthwhile pointing out that even just this week, Representative Eric Swalwell, who is a Democrat, he's been outspoken on things such as the Epstein files and has been accused of sexual violence and rape. And so, again, it is an example of folks calling out behavior or cultures, that they themselves are contributing to. But kind of the big story of this week is this photo that Trump posted, and he's now claiming that he thought he was a doctor and the Red Cross. And it's just his ability to lie on the spot is pretty impressive. Also, having grown up with a narcissistic liar, I'm like, yeah, like, how do you learn this? Like, you're very good at it. To give him credit for something, I will give him credit for being an effective on the spot liar.
Yeah.
But I think the religious aspect and sort of hypocrisy of accusation and confession is fairly well tread ground. We know what has happened over the years with the Catholic Church, for example. And so I'm curious, with your upbringing as well that you've talked about on the show, how do you see some of these religious foundations in this conversation?
It's interesting what's happening right now with, on one hand, you have Trump posting AI generated pictures of himself as Jesus and or doctor for Red Cross to be determined. That alongside the recent levies of the Trump administration against the Pope and the Vatican,
Mm,
and being really anti-Pope, getting involved and suggesting that this pro like Christ kind of message that I think the Trump administration toes, because they do lean into, I think, their religious conservative base quite heavily, of saying that this is actually fundamentally not Christian and it doesn't reflect the values. It's interesting because I do want to also stress what you said, that this is not simply something that happens on one political spectrum. And I think the Catholic Church is a really interesting example of this, that maybe right now, we've got a woke Pope or whatever. And so Pope Leo is going even further than Francis, and people are really excited about the backbone of the Catholic
mm,
Church. But absolutely, I mean, we know that this is an institution that consistently protects pedophiles and abusers. And so a couple of years ago, there was lots of spotlight on well documented and horrendous abuse that had been covered up by the church, and they were somewhat unpopular. And now suddenly the pendulum has swung, and because they're in contrast to another sort of evil, but it's all connected.
right. Because it's still always about people, and people's politics change for
Hmm.
any number of reasons. And that's why I like the tree metaphor. When we're talking about root causes, it's something that supersedes political leaning and political affiliation.
When I was thinking about this week's episode, I was reviewing notes and trying to articulate what I meant. And something that came up was actually a reflection on my own religious upbringing and experience. And so, again, for listeners, I was raised Protestant, evangelical, non denominational. So I
So
don't
many buzzwords.
so many buzzwords, but I think if you know, you know, and that like I'm definitely not a Catholic or I wasn't raised Catholic. I was raised in the Protestant vein. We would say non denominational, but for folks, because I know we also have some folks not in the States or that maybe aren't religious, non denominational is oftentimes a placeholder for evangelical because
Mm,
evangelical has a connotation and it also has different layers depending on where you are geographically in the States. So that can mean something different in the deep South versus where I was raised. But certainly evangelical and that core tenets of the faith related to things like the anticipation of the rapture and the second coming of Christ and a lot of these sort of prophetic elements of the New Testament, which also then assume things like an antichrist. And it gets into things about Israel. And it's also connected very nicely, but also grossly to a lot of the reason why a lot of US Americans support the state of Israel and why there is such a large rallying amongst evangelicals in the United States in protecting the state of Israel because it's actually part of this prophecy in the New Testament of why we need to protect God's original people, even though most Jews
mm.
don't, or I would say part of the Jewish faith, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, Brett, is that y'all believe Jesus was real as a dude, but not the Messiah.
Oh, yes, that is correct. Yeah, there is recognition that he is a historical figure,
Yeah.
but not a religious one.
That is fundamental to an evangelical base is a deep connection to the state of Israel because it is part of this legacy or this line of potential prophecy. So that's where I grew up. In preparing for the pod, I was reflecting on again was this metaphor that we used to have in youth group called like the chair metaphor. And that
Mm,
I've touched on previously about how I grew up with in the church, the separation of gender and a gender binary. And when we were split up in a lot of the groups, a lot of the work that we were doing as women in women's Bible study or girls' Bible study or girls' small group was always somehow returning to this orbit of how can we be supportive of the men in our congregation
mm.
and the people that we will be in relationship with, usually with the anticipation that that'll be your future husband, your future spouse. But also in the meantime, because we're friends, we're going to summer camp together, we're spending a lot of time. As you are getting older, how do you keep yourself in line so as to not allow men to fall into their own kind of
Mm.
whims?
Be tempted.
Exactly. And so temptation and this potential for sin is something that you're self policing quite a bit, or you're policing amongst one another. And we talked about this chair metaphor a lot, which is you have to imagine that the men in the congregation, for example, were standing on top of a chair. And if someone is standing on a chair and you reach your arm up to them and they reach it back to you, it's super easy for you to pull them off of the chair. It's just
Mm,
basic physics. And so we were kind of always positioned in this story as women of being the ones surrounding men on a chair and pulling them down into sin through our actions. And it would be a
mm,
lot more difficult for us to, and it would be a more noble cause for us to actually try to go up on the chair with them, to elevate them, or to create the conditions that you weren't pulling them down. It kind of gets flimsy when you try to invert it. It doesn't really make sense.
yeah.
But essentially, the core tenet of it was it is your responsibility to not pull someone down on the chair by being
Uh-huh.
modest in the way you dress, by not being flirtatious in your behavior, by not being suggestive, by being abstinent. And when I think about that now, not only do I see that metaphor as being flimsy, but also feeling very much of the accusation towards women that you are the one that bring a man down into temptation
Hmm.
feels as much to me now as both bullshit as it does like a direct confession. I don't want to make it that every guy is a predator, but I see it now as endorsing the conditions that like this is something that's probably going to happen.
Yeah. So this is an interesting metaphor. It's not one I've heard before. Obviously, we have very different upbringings in that sense. But there's something. So I think the first thing that I don't like about it, which is maybe also intentional, is that the metaphor is a chair.
Mm.
And like you said, it's more part of the metaphor is that it is more difficult to be pulled up onto the chair. It's also a structure that is unsustainable for more than one person. So it's not a condition that like women in this metaphor are being encouraged to like figure out how do you navigate that struggle to find your place on the chair. But instead, it's all about how do you police yourself to not bring a man down to your level. It's not how do we get to this higher place of sanctity or whatever it is. Like, it's not a structure that can support more than one person.
Sure.
So I think that there's an interesting element to that. There's also, I mean, I don't know how if this is a true parable or thing in the Bible, but it's a thing I've heard before. So I'm going to say it, and you tell me if it's just Instagram falsehood. But isn't there a story in the Bible where I think it was Jesus said to men that, like, if you are finding yourself tempted by women to the point that you would cause violence upon them, then you should gouge your eyes out, because it is your responsibility for your actions, and it is not for others to police how you are tempted by them.
Yes, with a slight amendment that I think the text is less about committing violence towards, but it would be extended. It's more that if you are looking at another man's wife, Christ would say that it is your responsibility to pluck your own eye.
So this is a question I'm curious, like, from a political, academic, theological angle. Why do we think people are okay being hypocrites? Like, I think Democrats and folks on the left think that hypocrisy is a stronger, or naming hypocrisy is a stronger shaming tool, weapon, than it actually is. Like, naming Trump's hypocrisies has done nothing either to prevent his ascendancy or to really do anything in convincing his followers that he is not a good person, that he's not a good businessman, that he is causing an immense harm on localized ways and global scales. But naming that hypocrisy has not resulted in the impact that I think folks on the left think that it should.
I think about this a lot, and I appreciate the question. I think there's a couple of things, but I will preface this by saying I don't know if my diagnosis is accurate, but it's a question that continues to come up and something that I wrestle with. On one hand, I think that there is this, I agree with you. There's this sort of, it's almost West Wing-y, Aaron Sorkin kind of trail or caricature of the Democratic Party. Yeah, we've kind of taken up this I call it the Aaron Sorkin like monologue, that if somebody just explains to you for a while the Jed Bartlett of telling you exactly
For a while.
yeah, it's usually a little bit of a lecture. It's kind of sermon related, but when somebody pulls a Jed Bartlett and tells you the facts and tells you exactly why you're wrong, then you will recognize that, be shamed into, with enough logic and with enough moral high ground, you will change your position that was inevitably wrong. It makes me think about that one scene where there is a woman from an evangelical group that's in the room.
That's the pilot, actually.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. So then the pilot, there's this woman who's in this room. She doesn't stand up. Jed Bartlett walks in and she's giving him scripture. He out scriptures her. It's kind of like a rap battle, but with passages from the Bible. And she is shamed into, supposedly, we get the impression of recognizing how wrong she was because he was both intellectually superior, but then also was making kind of these morally appropriate points. And so I think that's something that a lot of us have internalized, and the Democratic Party continues to virtue signal. And yeah, it's not effective because the other part of it, and I might have mentioned this quote before on the pod, but what I think about it a lot in my writing is a quote by Karl Marx, where Karl Marx wrote that shame is a revolutionary feeling. And I just don't think that we have a lot of shame in this country generally. It's certainly reflected in our actions. And our willingness to overlook our own hypocrisy, I think, is rooted in a fundamental lack of shame. I've talked to people recently about how I just think our shame meter has gone from really small in this country to near non-existent. And I don't know if that's the proliferation of social media and this constant attention cycle where you can really just go from one headline or one big incident to the next and it's always replaced. And so that something is always going to overcome whatever news story was on 5 minutes ago. Or I don't know if it's the brazen attitude that especially has been projected in this administration where you can just fundamentally lie and people will tell you you're lying. And you don't feel any obligation to acknowledge it. You just go deeper into the lie, or you pivot and you deflect to something else and you move on to the next news cycle. But I think we have fundamentally lost maybe one of the only checks that we've ever had in politics for a long time, which was this element of shame. Like, why did Nixon resign when the impeachment was happening versus Trump is impeached however many times and was
Yeah.
perfectly fine staying in office? I have to think that there's some kind of element of shame in the hypocrisy that's missing.
It's such an interesting thought, and this idea that, especially coming from Marx, about shame as being a revolutionary feeling. Is that what you said?
A revolutionary feeling.
Because so I'm assuming that the context of it is that to feel shame about hoarding wealth or hoarding the means of production is and not having that is what allows capitalists to exploit. And folks who would feel shame in that position are the ones pushing a more collectivist uh, way of being. It is interesting because I think we often, as we've alluded to or talked about on the pod before, of that you either die young. We talked about this last week. I think you either die young or you live long enough to be the thing that you hate or that you are organizing against. And I think that is often what happens with people once they start to get money. You know, they lose that sense of shame or they lose that ability to empathize with others. And any number of celebrities, or I had a friend in town this weekend and we were talking about Gwen Stefani because she went to school at Cal State Fullerton, and there's an early 90s clip of No Doubt playing out on the quad, and now she's hella MAGA, you know? So like how does that trajectory happen? And you lose that sense of shame and that connection to real people once you start acquiring wealth. And that is the disease of capitalism. Folks, this is not our capitalism episode. We'll get there eventually. But I think it's an interesting point, and I think deserves some unpacking of how do folks lose that sense of shame and lose empathy. And I think that there is a connection there. You know,
Okay.
that if you no longer have the ability to empathize, then you can't feel shame. And in this conversation and thinking about accusation and confession and our largely inability to be circanized through dialogue or lecture is in part what Trump has also very effectively done, is turning any kind of critique, saying it is fake news, saying, you know, like being able to convince us. And I think this was I'm forgetting where the quote comes from at the moment, but that 1984, I think, where we're being told that what we're seeing is not what we're seeing. And
Yeah.
he is incredibly effective at that. And like why folks are willing to believe him over what they're seeing is just one of the great, not mysteries, but things that will be studied and discussed for decades in folk trying to understand, particularly the last 10 years, and then whatever the fallout is once he's no longer around. But there has been this like willful ignorance and willful pulling of the veil over our own eyes, that it's a loss of empathy. It's also like allowed a lot of people to lean into, I think, their basest selves for some reason in a very hypocritical way, because it's often folks who are engaging in, you know, they claim to be the moral minority or whatever, or that they function on the higher ground, but then have just completely debased themselves in order to be at the feet of Trump. And I'm thinking of people like Lindsey Graham, who claimed a particular right wing righteousness and has really debased everything that he claimed he stood for. I think there is a particular Americanness to lack of ability to feel shame because we are a very self centered country and very selfish in our pursuit. As we talked about early on in season one, the pursuit of the American dream is a very selfish one. And we are willing to try to advance our own well being at the expense, not only at the expense of other people, but often at our own short term expense. Where, you know, this idea that people will vote against their financial interests, thinking that eventually they will become rich.
This is such an onion in terms of all of the layers of it. Is absolutely related to this neoliberalism that is embedded in the American dream. This idea that people will actively vote against their own interests because they are looking, or they have this fervent belief in the dream. I think it's also very much And it's not our capitalism episode, it's not our empire episode, but I think it's also a diagnostic that can be contributed to empires, also whiteness and white supremacy and white nationalism, which also both is a mechanism to not feel shame about your actions, that you should be proud of it, but also to constantly flip the script that anytime someone comes at you to say, oh, you're doing this, you're doing that, it's sort of that reverse racism card of like, oh, well, now you are being discriminatory against me. Or even with the shame concept, I think I've talked about how there's not a feeling of shame, but then so many people do speak about how for however many years prior to Trump, Trump is this emboldening for them, this ability for them to finally, as you said, come back to their most basal selves. But I think they would say to finally be proud of who they are. I mean, you have people like JD Vance saying, like, you should be proud of your heritage. You should be proud
Mm.
of XYZ. And it's all these immigrants and other people that are telling you, don't be proud. Or Eric, I think about Erica Kirk recently being like, don't ever let anyone tell you that you can't be proud of being a white man. And it's this flip of that shame of saying, like, you've actually been shamed into being less of yourself, which is both something I think to be taken seriously if enough people feel that way, but also we would know fundamentally and through the data is just not support it. I mean, it's just factually untrue that you would have a disadvantage in this case because of whiteness or maleness, when we understand that the intersection of patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy is still very much the dominant logic here. So it's just this onion that is really frustrating to live with, I would say.
Mm.
I don't think I have to tell you that, but I would just say out loud, it's frustrating to be a part of a culture that has all of these layers, but then it, again, is much more comfortable with accusing as opposed to confessing. Welcome back, folks. Brett, before the break, the referenced a quote, which is from the Nolan Dark Knight trilogy, which is, you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain,
Mm.
or the Brett
Is that
version.
what it was from? It was from Dark Knight? Okay.
It's Harvey Dent, who becomes
Ooh.
Two-Face, saying that, right? And spoiler alert, Harvey Dent
Well,
becomes Two-Face, so he didn't die the hero. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this because I think that this movie and some of the characters and particularly some of the villains are really interesting in highlighting this accusation as confession. For me, I think about that through the Joker character, who is constantly talking about the rampant corruption and the hypocritical nature of the people in Gotham, of both like wanting a Gotham that is not rampant with corruption and then also constantly feeding and buying into that, sort of being a product of and an enabler of, while himself also doing that. So he's like calling
mm,
it out, and that's kind of his MO. Comic book nerds, DC people, don't come at me because I know that this is one interpretation and blah,
mm.
blah, 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 blah. And Joker is kind of a sociopath, so we can't really take him seriously. But I think for the audience and for the purpose of the chat, it's a good franchise to think about in the way that it highlights accusation, confession.
Forgot that it was from the Dark Knight. And I think, yeah, DC nerds don't come at me. Not the canon of nerddom that I'm swimming in all the time. But I feel like Batman in general is an interesting example for this conversation, because also an element of hypocrisy, because he's obviously coming from a place of trauma, but is also a little sociopathic and very hyper violent in different depictions. So there is a degree of being the thing that he is trying to undermine or undo.
Right.
And, even the sense of doing things sort of as a vigilante, there is an element of being outside of the law and not totally in line with this vision of justice that he's trying to uphold. But I like this discussion of, that what's interesting about Batman villains is often there is this political nature, this commentary element of they are calling attention to the corruption, the lack of morality in Gotham. And they are this kind of hyper realization of the thing that they're critiquing, but then are also contributing to it. Weirdly, I love the third movie.
Ooh,
I think
hot take.
that a hot take. I mean, you gotta love Tom Hardy as Bane. Such a
For you?
fun Are you kidding me? This is like, he is very, like, this is a well-renowned performance. And like the
Okay.
voice is great.
Okay.
It's such a fun performance, but also like what was so interestingly, there's a scene towards the end where I think it's Bane's followers are like there's a riot with the police. They're in like downtown Gotham. They shot that on Wall Street and had to block it off so that Occupy couldn't get near there so that they could stage a fake Occupy like encampment and protest. And we were like, just pay us. We're right here. Like, we'll come eat crafty for a day and be your extras. But instead they blocked it off so we couldn't get there. But Bane very much is kind of this like working class hero. His commentary on Wall Street, and he beats up Glenn, what's his face, in the stock exchange, a young the actor who's now like blowing up.
Glenn Powell?
Yeah.
Didn't even remember he was in that.
And yeah, he gets punched. But it's this interesting way of trying to highlight hypocrisy and like, how do we become the thing that we are critiquing, and where is that line? Is some things that in science fiction or fantasy or superhero stories often are wrestling with, where villains are walking this fine line of critique and hypocrisy.
Yeah, you're making me think a lot of things. Especially maybe I need to go rewatch Dark Knight Rises. I hated that movie. I'm sorry.
Anne Hathaway also, I did not particularly care for her for a long time. I really like her Catwoman.
I mean, shame on you for not liking her after she was the Princess of Genovia twice.
Which I did not see until 2 years ago. No, I still didn't even see it. Did I? I can't remember. Did I? I think I went to bed.
We didn't even watch it.
Oh, okay. Well, that's why I didn't see it then.
But
I think I'd watched it after that. So for listeners, Nicole had a large gathering for her 30th birthday. One of the events was to watch The Princess Diaries.
Mm-hmm.
I think I went to bed because
That's
was significantly older than everyone else in attendance.
Nope.
Significantly, disgustingly older.
Absolutely
and
not.
shamefully older.
No, you just are. You have no shame. Speaking of shame, you just have no shame in putting yourself to bed.
It's true.
Dr. Brett is the perfect guest if you want someone to Irish goodbye the night and literally good night, sleepy time. Aside from this movie, which did have good cast members in it, I'm not, even my old high school crush, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, was in this. So it's well stacked. I love Christian Bale. I love Christopher Nolan. I didn't like the film, but I do think you're making me kind of think about this line, which I think Nolan's trilogy does exceptionally. And I would even point to the film prior and to Heath Ledger's Joker, and Joker consistently talking about the similarities between him and Batman, and which is something comic book nerds that is very heavily talked about in the comics, and the way that Batman is himself very much the thing that he's claiming to be against for different reasons and in different iterations. Certain qualities come out more than the other, but this idea that in one context you are the savior and another you are the villain is interesting. To bring it to the art imitating real life, I can't not see that in the way that a lot of the actions of the US have been, like how we think about the US as a previous moral beacon, which is not accurate. Spoiler alert. But there has been this rhetoric that we have championed amongst ourselves and even internationally, which people are now coming and saying, oh man, it's really sad that the US is no longer sort of this moral police in the world, that this shining democracy. And depending on where you have been in the world, that has never been the case and has been confronted very intensely. But it's always been this presentation.
Like while we've been critiquing others and been the moral voice of the world, we've never upheld it domestically.
So I think on that sense, that is a perfect encapsulation of accusation versus confession. And you're accusing these people in other parts of the world of being at one point savages, at another point being radicals, of being terrorists, of doing all of these things, of Hegseth, like I said in the voice note, Hegseth chastising the Iranian regime for not providing its citizens with basic fundamental rights and spending all of its money on militarization. And then at the same time, Trump literally talking about how we don't have money for childcare because we are now involved in a military conflict. So that line, in one context, I am the hero, and in the other, I am the villain, is really interesting alongside this idea of accusation and confession to me, because it's often the motivation of both the villains and the heroes in these films, of them to accuse the other of doing some kind of abhorrent or problematic behavior that needs to be stopped, that is morally supported to be stopped. And yet, depending on the framing, because then I think about, which is probably a film I suspect you didn't like, the movie Joker with Joaquin Phoenix, which is complicating the Joker character. Depending on that framing, that guy is a hero to some people. So then we also have to talk a little bit about framing,
Mm.
because depending on who's winning or who has the most support or who politically has the upper hand, the same kind of action can be presented with either outrage or praise.
Yeah, it's often about the platform of the speaker and the context, like you said. Maybe not surprising. I did not see Joker. I could kind of tell based on just some of the way it was being talked about before it came out that it was going to be platformed or sort of put on a pedestal by a particular demographic of white dude that
Mhm.
was going to be used to justify a lot of toxic behavior. And I had really no interest in supporting that and platforming it. I don't know if I really had an opinion about Lady Gaga being in a sequel to it. And
Didn't watch that one. Heard it was so bad, wasn't
yeah,
worth the
so,
view. But it also makes me think in terms of framing the infamous Joseph Goebbels, which I've also learned having a German partner that in English we just completely butcher this name. So don't come at me, Germans, but Joseph Goebbels, famed propagandist for the
but
Nazis.
also not someone that maybe even deserves us pronouncing his name right. Like,
But I like that better.
fuck him.
Yeah, fuck it. Whatever his name is. He said that if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, the people eventually will believe it. And we talked about this before, and you prompted that question of, what is it about Trump in particular that allows so many people to buy into it? And I would ask the same thing as it relates to Israel Palestine at this point. And I've shared how, from my personal experience as growing up evangelical, I understand why there's a lot of people that are very invested in Israel flourishing in that region, because they believe it to be an extension of an eventual prophecy, kind of similar to that American dream. It's like, I'm willing to let all of this stuff happen because I fundamentally believe that my reward at the end of this is going to be good. And in that case, for evangelicals, it's typically this association that really Israel is just a pawn in a larger game that they're playing, but I will support them because it supports the ends that I see for myself.
And with that one, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a little bit of like accelerationism, right? Where
Mhm.
there's belief that in supporting Israel and that it's going to bring upon the rapture, right? And
Sure.
the
Yeah.
end of the world, basically.
And people are always looking for signs of the prophecy. I think a lot of podcaster pundits, some of these mega church people, I'm not tapped into that anymore, but they tend to float these things similar to conspiracy, but it's named prophecy. But like when I was in high school, the reason why my church, a lot of people didn't want to vote for Obama is because there was a large prophecy reveal that Obama was the Antichrist. So, like, it people at different times in history come up as these figureheads. But yeah, there's absolutely this belief that these things are actively happening now and that we accelerate it by investing in
Mm.
particular outcomes. That's only one part of it. I think there's a lot of residual shame, speaking of, from the events of World War II, and that people don't know how to maybe navigate the duality of what happened in the Holocaust, and also the fact that that same group of people in a particular place have weaponized that to now endorse their own form of genocide. I
Yeah.
mean, it's interesting that, like, so many people have endorsed in different ways this lie about the state of Israel as being something that has a moral right to exist, and that any actions that they have are therefore sanctioned by it, while at the same time being an apartheid state that is predicated on the extermination of a particular faith group and ethnic minority that they have actively driven out. And I think that is something that, to me, is not only something that the MAGA base and Trump have endorsed, but it's difficult for me to see something like the state of Israel and what they've done in Palestine and now Lebanon, and separate that from the way that the Trump administration has presented itself as being morally correct, that they have this endorsement due to, in this case, the last election, that he won by a landslide. So therefore, it is a blank check to do whatever you want, even though it's predicated on lies. It feels like the repetition ultimately stabilizes the narrative regardless of verification. And I don't want to be nihilistic about it, but it feels like it doesn't matter because at the end of the day, eventually people are going to believe it if you just keep saying it enough. And then the result or the aftermath of that is that these atrocities happen. And maybe there will be a reckoning. But with Palestine, a little too fucking late for the world to wake up and realize that this was a genocide. People said that from the beginning. People have said
Mhm.
that. Like, we love that book, Hollow Land by A.L. Weisman. Like, this was clear from the get-go. And yet now people suddenly are waking up. And that's great. But it doesn't change the fact that all of these people have died and will continue to die because the lie was just repeated enough.
And I think it's a similar conversation as where one of the places we started with why is all of a sudden there a line for MAGA folks with Trump that
Yeah.
now they're willing to see the emperor has no clothes. When will that line be developed or revealed for folks who have been so pro-Israel and enabled their genocide for decades? When might we decide that there is a line? And this idea of that we keep telling the lie or the lie is being told to us and we just keep buying into it. You're pointing it out at the national, international scale. I think that this is also a very personal process that happens, again, related to this idea of accusation and confession, where when I was reading some of your notes in preparation for the episode, it was making me think about the work that I've done in gender studies and how masculinity is often talked about and analyzed as being the gender is performance for regardless of where an individual sees themselves on the gender spectrum, that so much of gender is about the performance and performativity of often normative gender roles and gender expectations. And particularly masculinity is a performance. It is an ideal. It's an aspiration. I often talk about it as being a moving goalpost, or the finish line of a race, but it's constantly moving. Whether that is how much money we're making, how many women men are sleeping with, how perfect our masculine physique is, it's always a line that is just out of reach, so that men are constantly failing to get to that aspiration, and in that failure men become angry, and that is, as bell hooks tells us, the only acceptable emotion for men. But so much of the analysis of masculinity talks about this performance as maybe in contrast to what we might expect. The performance is not for women. It's not to get sexual partners, but it's actually for other men. And it's really only other men that can validate the performance. So hypermasculinity has this inherent element um, of almost an element of homoeroticism where we are performing for other men. We want our identities to be validated by other men because in a patriarchy, in a misogynistic culture, the opinions of women or femme folks are less valued. So their validation is not as significant or important in this culture. And there is the newest iteration of that. And I don't think we're going to get too far into this today, but is this new looks maxing phenomenon on social media where men are crafting their bodies, they're wearing lifts in their shoes, and there's this whole online tutorials about if you're wearing lifts, how do you then not look shorter if you take your shoes off once you've brought the woman back to your home. I was watching this whole, someone was commenting on a clip on Instagram. It's as ridiculous as make sure you have a dictionary hidden under your bed that you can step on. Once she's on the bed, you take your shoes off, just these ridiculous things. They're going through plastic surgery. They're wearing hair pieces, to look like their hair's not thinning, like all these different things. And they are not seeking the validation of women. It's about conquering women's bodies. It's about racking up notches on the bedpost. But the performance of it is for other men. And it is this lie that they are buying into about what it means to be a man, and that it is okay to lie as long as you're reaching this particular end goal. And so much of these ideas of masculinity are based in half truths and lies that we tell ourselves about who we are.
Yeah. I mean, I think accusation is rarely only about a stated object. I think it reveals a lot about what someone needs to stabilize within themselves or to defend, or maybe is insecure, or to go back
Mhm.
to shame, feels shameful about. I mean, yeah, the looks maxing group that has emerged as, in many ways, I think a response or a yes and to the male loneliness epidemic, to the themes we've talked about of patriarchy, of white nationalism, of a lot of uncomfortability that a lot of people have related to sexuality and presentation of gender. On one hand, you have looks maxing and you have this performative element for men, for other men, even though it's in the name of getting women and, yeah, having a higher body count or whatever. But then the other part of that is also, I think, about accusation and confession related to the trans community. The
Mhm.
loudest proponents of anti trans legislation often themselves are often the ones insecure about that themselves. I mean,
Mhm.
Kristi Noem's husband, and I'm not here to kink shame, but Kristi Noem's husband has recently come out as somebody who is considering, I believe the most recent thing I read was considering a transition surgery, but we know has actively been involved in bimbofication and dressing up like a woman for a sexual fetish. And yet she has actively targeted and he has
Mhm.
supported her by supporting her politically anti-trans and anti-immigrant and anti-LGBTQ plus initiatives. And so it's all connected in a way that is really disturbing, and I think needs more so than we'll have time for today on the pod, but certainly needs a larger conversation to happen, because we should be interrogating the function of an accusation as a displaced confession
Mhm.
and about what it's revealing internally about our own anxieties or our own agendas. I think it can be, in the case of looks maxing, this might be a reflection both of a anxiety that one has around the performance of masculinity and maybe their own sexuality, as much as it is a agenda. And so I think there's a lot there that needs to be reckoned with, because, as I said earlier, what doesn't feel sufficient about accusation and confession is like when these things come true, when the world realizes, for example, that Palestine has been right all along in what it has claimed about itself compared to the state of Israel. That when everyone realizes that Israel is an apartheid state, that's wonderful that people are suddenly, or countries are suddenly acknowledging that and refusing to do business with them. But it doesn't erase what happened before. And I talked about how, like, saying I was right feels good in the moment, but it doesn't feel sustaining. And then what comes from this, and maybe we can talk about this on a future pod episode, because I don't have a resolve for it, is the way now that I think about this of, like, in the aftermath, when people realize when the accusation and confession are one of the same, what to do with the rage that I feel towards these
Mhm.
people. Like MGT coming over and now saying, or Tucker Carlson, or all these people, Alex Jones saying that Trump is a lunatic and has been wrong this whole time, is wonderful because you have more people on your side politically, or allow, more, the tide is shifting and you can sense that. But I just think about all of the hurt that's happened since that. And when they were on that side, what do you do with the rage that exists in you of saying, thanks, I was right, but what do I do with you now that you're on my side? Now that you recognize the confession and the accusation, it doesn't feel sufficient just to be right.
Yeah. And I think it doesn't feel sufficient to be right or to have these folks on our side on this particular issue, because I think we also know that they're making a calculation that it is to their political, financial, social advantage
Mhm.
to be on this side of history in this moment. And they made the calculation over the last decade that supporting Trump was to their advantage. So it doesn't feel like it is a moral shift. It does feel like there is an element of hypocrisy even in that, of this taking this stance now. I think what you were speaking to is that the accusations are not only individual confessions, but they're cultural confessions. And they are helping to reveal, like you said, agendas. And they are revealing of, like I've talked about a little bit this week and last week with the tree, they are revealing of the tree. They are helping us to not just see the forest, but the particular inner workings of our cultural formation. And it is revealing, like you said, that we are not here to kink shame, but we can power shame. And when folks are hiding their kinks with violence and with oppression and with agendas that are impacting other folks who are engaging in their same lifestyles, that we absolutely can and should critique. But it is this outward accusation hiding the inward confession that is also revealing of what is limiting of our culture, in which folks feel like they need to make these maneuvers that are harmful to folks very similar to themselves in terms of desire or lifestyle or identity. That is revealing of the failures of our culture to allow folks to embrace a full range of identity and humanity.
Welcome back, folks. Time for our closing segment, our closing signature segment, more comment than a question. And no, we're not taking any follow-ups.
Not today, not any day.
So, Dr. Brett, I might not be qualified to make this comment, but
Hasn't stopped us before.
no, it hasn't stopped. It won't stop. Can't stop. And as you know, probably because you live in the area, Coachella has been happening. And I don't really know if it's real and how it impacts LA or not, and that everybody clears out. But I find it really interesting the way that Coachella is still a big thing. And kind of my comment is I'm a little over it. I think it would have been super cool to see or go to Coachella back in its heyday. And I'm thinking about probably what I'm always thinking about with music of like the time when we were all in business casual at the club, the mid aughts. But nowadays, what I've seen a lot of people do and is people are like watching Coachella at home. So it's like home Chella because you can pretty much watch all of their performances online. And so I'm not a hater of music festivals, but the apparatus on Coachella just feels so fake and gross to me and just all influencer heavy. Or I saw this video of people watching the Justin Bieber concert, which is a vibe, but it was just everybody with their phones up where I'm like, I just think this has outlived itself and it just feels really ridiculous to the point where I'm like, I could just, like, we have Coachella at home at this point, literally, that yeah, I'm kind of over it. And I'm sure a lot of people are, but enough people seem to be going that it'll probably be back next year. But I think we have Coachella at home.
So I'm sort of going to comment on this comment in a way that is adding to your comment. So listeners, let us know if we're breaking our own rules here. I learned recently that Coachella largely started because of Pearl Jam's early 90s boycott of Ticketmaster. And they wanted to demonstrate that you could do a large scale performance outside of the mainstream ticket industry, which often was tied to most of the venues. You had to use Ticketmaster. And so what started as a anti-capitalist attempt to make music has now become hyper capitalist. It's only accessible by influencers and people who can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to rent houses and things. Yes, it is not what it was and maybe should no longer be what it is. But my actual comment or my own comment, saw a film over the weekend that I cannot recommend enough. I'm not going to get too much into it because I want folks to experience it in the way that they like to experience movies, which will not be with my spoilers until we next do our movie episode, is Project Hail Mary. I love me some Ryan Gosling. We have mentioned him before, and I went in knowing very little about it, as folks who listen to the Oscars episode know. That is how I want to experience films. And beautiful, funny. Weirdly, the author claims that none of his books are political, yet this is a movie about space travel, climate change, nations coming together to fund this space exploration, topics that are inherently political, whether a white dude who wrote it sees it or not. It is political, and it is unfortunate that he doesn't see that. But it is a fantastic film that is absolutely worth your time. It is also beautiful. Stay through the credits for some incredible space photography, but definitely a film that I suggest seeing in the theater if you are able to. It is a cinematic experience, and I imagine we will be talking about this film in a year when we do Oscars Grab Bag Part 2.
Yeah, co-sign on that because you commented on my comment. The book is fantastic.
I do want to read the book now.
And the other work that's notable from that is Artemis and The Martian. So another
Poop
great,
potatoes.
yeah.
Haven't seen the movie. That's all I know about it.
But I think on that note, we will get out of your ears, folks. Feel free to share that pod, please. We're trying to build a little bit of an audience bigger than our very faithful and lovely audience that we have. Thank you so much for all of the support so far, especially in season 2. We have seen that count, those likes, all those things increase, and that's a direct result of you all. But smash that like and subscribe button, share the pod, and we'll be back next week. Thanks so much, and talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. Doc to Doc is co-hosted, written, produced, and edited by us, Dr. Brett S. Goldberg and Dr. Nicole K. Mayberry. Our original music was written and performed by Matt Bogdanow, and our original artwork was illustrated by Andre Gonzalez. Doc to Doc is an independent podcast and a conversation across place, perspective, and friendship. We record Doc to Doc between Washington, D.C. and Orange County, California. In Washington, D.C., we record on the ancestral lands of the Nacotchtank Anacostans, also known as the Anacostan or Nacotchtank peoples, and near the lands of the Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples. In Orange County, we record on the traditional and unceded lands and waters of the Hashiman and Tongva tribal nations.